My pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to spend a little bit of time engaging with you in conversation, and we'll have some opportunities for that after the presentation. But this idea about creativity and how it impacts and is part of, clearly, architecture process. You're all involved in the creative process in some ways, whether it's your profession, or your vocation, your hobby, or your day-to-day lives, where, as Jeff said, we all have to problem solve, and it takes creativity to do so. We want to talk today a little bit about how architecture supports and can support the operations and mission of our clients' buildings. So thinking beyond just the structure or the artistic portion of that. And maybe we'll be able to share a few things unique to architecture, and together, through your thoughts on creative process, kind of share and think through those ideas. As Jeff said, I've been in the profession now for 35 years in a couple of firms in Fargo, founding partner of Shultz and Associates Architects in our 20th year of business, where we work in a very collaborative studio. We're a operation of 8 to 10 folks, do projects of small scale and large scale, but together in that collaborative environment in our open office, we challenge each other, we collaborate with each other, always working towards this sort of continuous creative process, which I just continues to, after 35 years, continues to invigorate me, that in connection with the impact in the work we get to do personally with our clients. So today let's talk a little bit about the idea of design, and I'm trying to think of this sort of continuum of design from the perspective of, on one hand, I'm going to use symmetry, which is part of our topic today, and I'll hit on that a couple of times, but think of that as sort of pure design for the sake of design, making design decisions to create beauty, function, whatever the case may be. And on the other end of the spectrum is this idea of subjective design, which I think there's an awful lot of built environment today that we can all agree it's sort of hard to understand where the ideas came from or what is behind it. So symmetry, of course, came from Greek and Roman architecture, this idea of sort of purity, of something that oftentimes is balanced between the center line, and it may be truly symmetrical, or it may be something that's balanced where elements are playing off of each other. So think of that here again about the, less specifically, but more to the idea of pure design. Subjective design is a lot of what we see in the built environment today, I think, that doesn't necessarily have a basis for how it got there. So it's either someone's idea, it's that, hey, let's just do this, or sometimes it can be, here's the trend, right? Here's the materials we want to use. And so all of a sudden you see those same materials showing up in publications, in finished work, or a design idea that's kind of the design of the year or the decade. You know, if you go back, you can start to see buildings that were built in 2010 or 2000 or 1990 and say, well, yeah, that was kind of what we were doing at that point in time. So back to kind of my continuum here, pure design on one side, I'll call it arbitrary design on the other. We think there's a sweet spot in the middle there that really provides for the greatest opportunity for creativity. Yes, there's times when we want to be very pure in a design or a design element. And there's times when maybe we want to have some whimsy. But how is that accomplished in a way that's purposeful? And I'm going to talk about sort of three elements that get there. One is ordering principles. Talk about that in a moment. Symmetry is one of those. The tools that we all use in the creative process, at least the artistic creative process, to generate solutions. Second, as I've mentioned, this idea of mission-driven design. What is the owner or the building user really accomplishing? Not just we need shelter for more people because we have a staff that's increasing in size, but how can architecture drive that further? And third is this idea of integrity. We're in this beautiful space this morning. We know that's a masonry wall. We know that these columns are load-bearing. We know that these beams are supporting the roof. And yet so much architecture today sort of lacks that. And maybe it's, I call it cake decorating sometimes. The exterior of our buildings become nothing more than what's the finish on them. And we walk in a door and we see something outside, and we come inside and what do we have? Our friend drywall, right? So let's talk about these three elements here, kind of foundational elements. So you're certainly, many of you are very familiar with ordering elements. Symmetry is one of those. We've talked about that. Axes we think is very important, or important tool to be used to kind of determine where do I enter a building and where am I heading, or where is a cross axis happening that becomes a point of particular use or interest, and how do I sort of navigate through the building. Building rhythms, structural rhythms, maybe they're uniform, maybe they're syncopated, they sort of move out of step. And transform. These last ones are really about how do you take those basic elements and start to play them off each other. So transformation, we move through the space, it changes as we move through. Or datum, which allows us to have what seemingly disparate elements that maybe have something that start to tie them together, that you've got something to kind of anchor them to, if you want to think about it that way. Or hierarchy, again, a pattern that breaks or is something at one level and hierarchically changes over the course of the process. So here's an example of an ordering process. This is some early concepts we did for the expansion of the Bobcat headquarters in West Fargo. So those of you who can imagine the building as it existed, very symmetrical building, had that sort of round front in the center. In expanding the building, there are a lot of internal ideas, but one of the elements was moving an entrance to the other side, getting it down on grade, because the original building was sort of a split level with some space underneath. And so how do we create a new entry? And you can see that we started thinking about, okay, well, this curved form of the existing lobby, how do we contrast that but pull off of it and create a stronger element, maybe with a curved entry form. And it moved from various locations, and the one on the top right really became kind of our working model that created the strong axes that you see in the straight orange line. It sort of moves it to the middle of the building. Where that ends is the major circulation point. It hits the disparate levels between the interior of the building. It's open. It's the place of collaboration with a cafeteria immediately adjacent, elevator circulation. And as you look down, if you can see the image here at the distance, this is that view down that lobby where you can kind of see the straight line. It heads to a stair at the far distance. In the foreground, you see the reception desk sort of moving into that axis a little bit, and beyond where you see the Bobcat logo on the wall, another curved wall that starts to formulate a gathering area, and even a rhythm of columns on the left, and some office or some meeting spaces that are sort of behind on a porch sort of element. So, the architecture really started to build off of the strategy. We didn't start by saying we need these spaces and arrange them and then come back and create an order for them. Similar on the exterior. Again, we had a very symmetrical original building. We wanted to add on, not replicate, not just extrude that out further and put some element at the other end, but to change the architecture of that original building a bit, but make sure that that new entry was clearly, without question, sort of where I go. The second foundational element is this idea of mission-driven design. There's really two pieces to this. The first is understanding the owner's mission and sort of at a broader level. Louis Kahn, early 20th century architect, thought a lot about materials and how they express themselves. But one of the things he said was the first thing an architect must do is to sense that every building you build is in a world of its own, and that this world of its own serves an institution. That's sort of the emphasis here that I'm looking for, is how does the built environment serve the function that it's providing. The second element of this is that we really believe that that quality architecture comes through an engaged process, that we work closely with our clients kind of side by side to develop the right solutions. This idea of an iterative process, we ideate, we talk, we refine, we come back, we ideate again, and that process is about, our job is to come up with a number of creative solutions and put them on a table and say, let's tear these apart, let's critique them. For those of you who spent time in the art and architecture curriculums, it was all about, we're going to do something and we're going to critique it. We see that as an ongoing piece where the solutions start to emerge, not because we like number 1 better than 2 and 3, but we like these pieces of 1, and that element of 2 is great, and number 3, let's just put that aside. That isn't really filling the bill. What's important at this point in the process, though, as well, is that it needs to be comprehensive. This is the time when all the other elements in the planning process need to come to bear. So things like, we have to, in the architecture world, we need to worry about mechanical systems. We need to worry about life safety codes and egress and those kinds of things. Green buildings, daylight. How do we really believe that especially in work environments that people are in on a daily basis, they need to have ready access to daylight and views. Oh, did I mention budget? Every project has a budget, and while oftentimes I think some people say, well, that's limiting my design. I will tell you this, I think budget is one of the best guardrails along with these other elements I've talked about that challenges you. That as you move through the process, you may start sort of broad, you may be doing planning for future phases, but as you start to talk about code elements, you start to talk about the budget, that challenge in collaboration with the owner helps you to prioritize and say, these are our top goals. Here's some things that we could do a different way and do less expensively. You really need to look at where you emphasize those dollars and so on. So a couple of ideas around, or examples of how mission has driven some of these designs. This is the Bobcat Acceleration Center, their innovation R&D center in Bismarck. The idea there was moving from a very siloed structure of engineers, manufacturers, suppliers, sourcing people, and move the process of design, especially for new product, from a linear process where we design this and then we turn it over to manufacturing and they say, well, we can't really build it that way, and we go back through. So we created spaces where all those groups came together, and we placed areas that were immediately adjacent to where new product was being built up, where manufacturing could set up new assembly lines, where you could actually get into an arena and operate a piece of equipment inside, because a couple months of the year the ground's frozen. And so that whole environment and whole idea came about because Bobcat said, we're the innovators in this compact market. We need to stay on top of our game. We've got everybody nipping at our heels here, kind of doing what we're doing or trying to move into market share. We need to get to speed to market, and we need to stay on top of the game. Different end of the spectrum. Facilities for providing services for, in this case, both of them are for women. On the left is an example of the YWCA Women's Shelter that we constructed or designed about 18 years ago, 16 years ago. But in today's world, we need to add security, right? It's and certainly in that environment where women are moving away from a difficult situation, there needs to be very clear security. And so we were asked to create a ballistic security line inside the building off of the lobby. What you're seeing are the reception windows off of that lobby space, and that's bulletproof glass, those are bulletproof walls, but we've trimmed it out, we've created some scale that still tries to keep a much more of a homey environment than visiting somebody at some other institution. Or on the right side, the Jeremiah program in Fargo, which is helping 2 generations at a time is their motto, with moms, single moms and their kids, both getting an educational track to move themselves to success in the future. You know, the architecture can support that. Back to Bobcat's headquarters, you know, this idea, the whole idea went a step further from the Acceleration Center to say, you know, our groups of overhead, finance and marketing and dealer relations, all those sorts of elements, accounting, we need to also collaborate. And we're going to do so by going a step further and build a building that has no offices. This was a traditional office building. All the executives who were out of town 80% of the time had the offices on the outside wall, and there were tall cubicles, and even though there was a high space with some light on either end, it was a very dark environment. So folks come to work, they sit somewhere for a day, they move off their desk, they sit somewhere else tomorrow if they choose to do so. They can group with other team members in different locations under that environment. There's not a single office in the building, including the CEO. But it also provided these spaces for quick collaboration. You know, when you're innovating, you're creative, you don't set a schedule and say, next Tuesday, let's meet at 2 o'clock and get really creative about what we're trying to solve, right? It's often sort of something that needs to happen at the spur of the moment. So to create spaces where people can quickly gather and meet. Last, in the mission-driven design, this is Lakeland Mental Health Center, their facility in Fergus Falls. We started talking about the site, and I said, you know, instead of going down right at the intersection here that was this green buildable site, I said, why don't we move ourselves up the hill and get into this environment that we can share with your clients. So as the clients come to meet with their practitioners, their offices don't look outside at the parking lot. They don't look outside at the road. They in fact have a view out to the woods around, and we replicated this formula in an office we recently completed in Alex for them as well. The feedback was very clear. They said we have clients who, you know, their stress level as they come here is very different from the facility we were at previously, in the environment, in the daylight, and those sorts of things are part of that. And at some point, about 4 months later, the CFO, who was our primary contact on the facility, sent me this slide of 3 fawns outside of her window, and she said, I think we did it. So. Last, let's talk about integrity. Again, you know, I've got the perfect example that we're standing in today. This was a project for Otter County. They purchased for $1 a building on the Regional Treatment Center site in Fergus Falls. That was a geriatric facility, sort of double Y-shaped facility. They've got all their land offices, treasurer, administrative offices there, and move them out of the courthouse. One of the goals, though, was to create an entry. There was not a grand entry into the geriatric facility. If those of you who are old enough or have watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and remember the clay tile walls and these wards, that was exactly what this building was. But we created a new entry, and you can see, again, this idea of integrity. You know, it took some elements of stone that were just bands in the original building, brought that into this sort of leading wall. Off of that is built this glass entry. You don't have to, as you pull into parking, ask yourself where I go in. It's part of that. That stone continues on through the lobby as well. Back to the Acceleration Center in Bismarck, zinc panels. We like sort of pure materials that are their own material. That is, we're not trying to make them do something else. And we like those materials on the left side. That zinc panel comes into the lobby, sort of brings you into the building. Even on the windows, this was an opportunity at the Acceleration Center. We said, let's bring in some Bobcat orange and let's have it move across that facade in a way that's, you know, kind of illustrates the idea of acceleration. So that window pattern of the orange on green did that. And a police station also in Fergus Falls, that was built on a site between the county courthouse, which will be behind me in this view, and the city hall, which was a block the other way. 1919, fire took out most of Fergus Falls. They built courthouse in 1920, and also the city hall in 1920, and with this idea of a civic plaza. Well, other development happened between those two buildings. This was the opportunity to sort of take that master plan finally and bring it together. And so we took some of the stone, in this case it's much less expensive precast block, to create that entry element, and took a pattern of the brick from the courthouse, from City Hall, which was a Georgian style, and you probably can't see it in the image here, but you can actually see it out that other window, and brought that in, and so now we're starting to play in the urban scale of things, and again, you see those materials moving inside. So I hope this journey has been, kind of a helpful process, that we think there is, what people often think of as constraints to design are actually the opportunities for design. That the input and feedback and engagement, true engagement with the owner, is what produces something that's unique, that isn't the flavor of the day. It can pull in symmetrical or very intentional design elements, but how that's all pulled together really is through that process that we've created together. So we think that architecture really influences organizations, and that's the opportunity. It is more than just design. It's more than the product. It's how is it a tool, and we think that's where a lot of excitement and creativity plays in this design process for architecture. Thank you.